What if the official story was never the real story? What if the death of Princess Diana, the most beloved woman in the world, wasn't just a tragic accident in Paris, but the result of secrets buried deep inside the heart of the monarchy itself? Imagine, for a moment, a hidden diary. Not just any diary, but the private writings of Queen Camilla, a woman who for decades was painted as the other woman, a shadow lurking behind Charles while Diana captured the world's love. And inside this diary lies a confession so dark, so damning, it could reshape everything we thought we knew about that fateful night in 1997. She wrote about panic, about fear, about Diana's determination to go public with files she claimed to possess. Files that linked Camilla to MI6, the British intelligence agency that has long been whispered about in the shadows of royal intrigue. In these pages, Camilla admits what many never imagined she would dare say out loud, that Diana was prepared to expose her ties to the intelligence community, and that exposure could have destroyed not only Camilla but the monarchy itself. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Can you feel the weight of that? The most famous woman in the world, saying to her friends that she had evidence, that she had names, that she would go public. And opposite her, a woman whose entire life depended on staying in the shadows, suddenly facing the unthinkable, exposure. That tension, that collision of forces, feels like something out of a political thriller. But what if it wasn't fiction? What if it was the deadly reality that played out in real time? Think about it. Diana was on the cusp of transformation. She was no longer just the ex-wife of Prince Charles. She was the people's princess, courted by presidents, adored by millions, and hounded by a press that couldn't get enough of her every move. She had access, connections, and, according to Camilla's alleged diary, damaging information. Now ask yourself, could that combination make her not just a threat to Camilla, but to the establishment itself? And here's where the story twists. Camilla, in her private writings, describes begging Charles to handle it. Handle what? Handle Diana? Handle the files? Handle the scandal that was about to erupt if Diana went public? These words, if true, carry a chilling undertone. It's not just a plea, it's a trigger. Because weeks later, Diana was dead in a Paris tunnel, and the world has never stopped asking questions since. Do you remember where you were when you first heard the news? That gut punch when broadcasters announced the people's princess had been killed in a car crash? The images of crowds outside Kensington Palace, burying the gates in a sea of flowers, weeping for a woman they felt was theirs? Those memories are etched into history. But what if, behind the mourning, a darker story was playing out? One that pointed not to chance, not to fate, but to fear and control? Let's rewind. Let's go back to the months leading up to that night. Diana was restless, yes, but also determined. She was telling friends, they're going to do something to me. They're watching me. People brushed it off as paranoia. But is paranoia still paranoia when the diary of your greatest rival confirms that your fears were justified? Because here's the contradiction that makes this story impossible to ignore. Diana wanted to shine a light on secrets, while Camilla needed those same secrets to stay buried. One woman threatening exposure, another desperate for silence. What happens when unstoppable truth collides with immovable power? History tells us something gives way. And this is where we, as the audience, stand in the middle. On one side, the official narrative, the car speeding through the Alma tunnel, the paparazzi chase, the driver's intoxication. On the other, whispers of conspiracy, hushed voices pointing to intelligence agencies, power struggles, and cover-ups. But now add Camilla's alleged writings into the mix. Doesn't it feel like a missing puzzle piece suddenly sliding into place? Doesn't it raise more questions than it answers? Why would Camilla even mention Diana's files? Why would she put into words her plea to Charles to handle it? People don't casually write down the very thoughts that could incriminate them, unless the guilt or the fear is too heavy to carry alone. Could this diary have been her way of unburdening herself, never meant for the world's eyes, but powerful enough to change history once it surfaced? Let's not forget who we're talking about. Camilla was never meant to be queen. She was the scandal, the mistress, the one whispered about behind closed doors. Her entire existence within the royal circle was fragile, balanced on secrecy. And Diana, beautiful, beloved, outspoken Diana, threatened that balance every time she stepped in front of a camera. Now imagine the added weight of Diana saying, "I have files." Would Camilla really just sit back and wait for the bomb to drop? Or would she act? This isn't just a story about rivalry. It's about survival. Camilla wasn't fighting for love. She was fighting for her place, for her future, for legitimacy in a world that despised her. And Diana? She was fighting for truth, for freedom, for a chance to be heard without the chains of the crown. Two women on opposite ends of power, each with everything to lose. Doesn't it feel inevitable that something explosive had to happen? And here's where it gets even more haunting. If Camilla's diary is real, if her words about panic and fear are genuine, then it wasn't just a rivalry. It was a high-stakes game of silence, with MI6 lurking in the background. British intelligence, historically tied to protecting the monarchy, suddenly painted as a tool for secrecy. If Diana had indeed uncovered a link between Camilla and MI6, it wasn't just Camilla's reputation at stake. It was the monarchy's survival. Now, pause for a moment. Imagine William, years later, reading this. The son who lost his mother in the most public tragedy of the modern age. Reading the words of the woman who replaced her. Seeing her admit to panic. To begging Charles to intervene. What kind of rage, what kind of betrayal would that ignite in him? Could this be why William has always kept Camilla at arm's length, despite her position beside his father? The emotional storm swirling inside this story is almost unbearable. Grief, guilt, betrayal, power. But it's also compelling because it touches on the oldest questions of history. Who knew? Who acted? Who stayed silent? And perhaps most importantly, who benefited? Because in the end, Diana was silenced. And Camilla rose. The woman once vilified became queen consort. The mistress became the monarch. History flipped. And now, with these alleged writings surfacing, we're left to wonder. Was that rise built on silence, on secrets, and on the ultimate betrayal of the people's princess? This isn't just gossip. It's not just a scandal. It's the kind of story that forces us to re-examine the foundations of power itself. When truth threatens power, history shows us one outcome. Truth is buried. But diaries, no matter how private, have a way of bringing the past roaring back. And that's why this story matters now. Because whispers have a way of becoming headlines. Because William is no longer a boy grieving his mother. He is the future king, a man who will shape the monarchy. And if he believes Camilla's words, if he carries that fury, what does that mean for the future of the crown? We're about to peel back layers of this mystery, piece by piece, chapter by chapter. From Diana's final days, to Camilla's alleged communications, to the fateful night in Paris, to the fury that still lingers in William's heart. And as we unravel it, one truth will become clear. This is not just a story about the past. It's a story still echoing in the present. Because hidden inside Camilla's private writings is a chilling confession, one that could change how we see Diana's death forever. What if the most explosive scandal in royal history wasn't uncovered by journalists, investigators, or whistleblowers, but by something as intimate, as fragile, as a diary? A diary is supposed to be private, a place where thoughts are whispered in ink rather than spoken aloud. But when the wrong, or perhaps the right, eyes fall upon those pages, they can change everything. And that's where this story begins, with the discovery of Queen Camilla's alleged secret diary. Let me ask you this. Who found it? Was it stumbled upon by accident, tucked away in some forgotten drawer, or was it deliberately leaked by someone who knew the weight of what those pages contained? That mystery alone ignites curiosity, doesn't it? Diaries don't just appear. They surface with intention, and intention means motive. According to whispers that have circulated in certain circles, Camilla's writings were never meant to see the light of day. They were deeply personal, scrawled in private moments, and packed with the anxieties, fears, and guilty confessions she could never voice aloud. Imagine her hands shaking as she wrote lines like, "She said she had files, that she'd go public. I panicked." Words that, decades later, carry the force of a bombshell. Now, think about the implications of that. Why would Camilla write it down at all? Why risk leaving behind such damning evidence? Some say it was guilt, too heavy to carry silently. Others argue it was arrogance, the belief that no one would ever read it. But here we are, pulling back the curtain on words she never intended the public to hear. And those words set the stage for one of the darkest theories surrounding Diana's death. When the diary surfaced, even in fragments, it wasn't treated as just another curiosity. No, this was dynamite. Because inside were admissions that Diana, in her final months, had threatened to expose Camilla's ties to MI6. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about petty jealousy, not about private rivalries. This was Diana allegedly holding proof of secret communications between Camilla and British intelligence. The kind of revelation that, if public, could have shattered the monarchy's credibility overnight. But before we go too far, let's pause and ask, how reliable is this diary? Skeptics say it could be fabricated, a forgery designed to stir controversy. And that's a fair point. Diaries can be faked, handwriting mimicked, context twisted. But isn't it curious how what's written inside aligns with suspicions Diana herself voiced before her death? Remember, Diana told friends she feared for her life. She believed she was being watched. She believed they were plotting against her. And now, decades later, Camilla's supposed writings echo those same fears, but from the other side. Doesn't that alignment feel almost too precise to dismiss? Picture the scene, dusty boxes stored away, their contents forgotten, or hidden deliberately. Someone opens one, perhaps after Camilla rose to queen consort, perhaps earlier. Among the memorabilia, letters, photographs, keepsakes, lies the diary. Its cover worn, its pages yellowing with age. The finder flips through, at first expecting mundane musings. But then the words leap out. Diana said she would expose me. She had files. I panicked. I begged Charles to handle it. The heart stops. The breath catches. And suddenly, those words aren't just private, they're historical dynamite. And here's the cruel irony. A diary is supposed to be a record of truth. Yet when it comes to royalty, truth is always contested. If the monarchy thrives on image, secrecy, and silence, then a diary, raw, unfiltered, and personal, is the most dangerous weapon of all. Isn't it fitting that this story starts not with a press conference, not with a courtroom, but with ink on paper? But how could something this damning stay hidden for so long? That's another layer of the mystery. Was it buried intentionally by palace staff? Was it locked away in an archive, shielded by loyalists who understood its explosive potential? Or was it simply overlooked until someone, somewhere, decided the world deserved to know? And if so, why now? Timing, after all, is everything. Ask yourself, why would this diary emerge just as Camilla cements her position beside King Charles? Why not years ago, when she was merely the other woman, when public outrage would have destroyed her chances of acceptance? Could it be that the timing is no accident, that someone wants these words to stain her reign, to remind the public of the shadow she still casts over Diana's memory? The diary doesn't just reveal, it reframes. It suggests that Diana's death wasn't random, wasn't purely tragic chance, but the possible consequence of knowledge too dangerous to expose. And if those words are true, then we're not talking about a simple rivalry between two women. We're talking about an institution willing to protect itself at all costs. This raises the ultimate question. How do you prove or disprove what's written in a diary? Handwriting experts can be called in. Linguists can analyze phrasing. Historians can cross-reference details. But what about motive? What about the emotions behind the ink? The rawness of fear is hard to fake. The desperation of someone begging her lover to handle it feels too real, too human, to be the product of forgery. Or does it? Let me ask you directly. If this diary is real, what does it mean for the monarchy? What does it mean for Charles, who allegedly was told to handle it? And most haunting of all, what does it mean for William, who has lived his life believing his mother's death was a tragic accident? Imagine being him, flipping through these pages, seeing Camilla's panic written in black and white. Would that not ignite a fury deep enough to burn through every ounce of royal protocol? The discovery of the diary is the spark that lights this entire story. It's the moment when whispers become words, when speculation becomes evidence. And while skeptics can argue its authenticity, they cannot deny its power. Because once those words are read, they cannot be unread. Once suspicion is planted, it cannot be uprooted. But this is just the beginning. Because inside those pages, the entries don't just confess, they connect. They connect to Diana's final months, to her growing paranoia, to her threats to go public. And they force us to ask the question no one in the palace wants answered. Did Diana die because she knew too much? And that's where we go next. To the final months of Diana's life, the moments when she began to sense the walls closing in, when she voiced her fears, and when she claimed she had the files that would blow everything wide open. But what those files were, and what they meant, might just be the most terrifying part of this story. What if Diana's paranoia wasn't paranoia at all? What if every whispered warning she gave to her closest friends, every fear she scribbled in notes, was a roadmap to what was coming? In the final months of her life, Princess Diana wasn't just a woman trying to rebuild herself after divorce. She was a woman on the brink of revelation. And revelations are dangerous, especially when they threaten the very core of the monarchy. Let's go back to 1997. Diana had reinvented herself after her split from Charles. No longer shackled to the palace machine, she was freer, more radiant, more determined. The press still hounded her, but this time she wielded that attention like a weapon. She knew every camera flash was power, every headline was influence. And with Dodi Fayed at her side, she was suddenly global again. Hollywood, Paris, the Riviera. To the public, it looked like love. To Diana, perhaps it was more complicated. But beneath the glitz and glamour, there was a darker undercurrent. She was saying things, frightening things, that her inner circle couldn't ignore. Do you remember Paul Burrell, her trusted butler? He revealed that Diana left him a note claiming, "They are planning an accident in my car. Brake failure and serious head injury." At the time, people dismissed it as melodrama. But think about it now, against the backdrop of Camilla's alleged diary. Doesn't it suddenly sound chillingly prescient? How could she have imagined such detail if it wasn't based on something real, something she'd uncovered? In her last months, Diana was restless. She told friends she was about to expose a lot of things. But what were those things? According to the diary, she believed Camilla was secretly in contact with MI6 officials. To Diana, that wasn't just betrayal. It was proof that the monarchy wasn't just a family, but a machine backed by intelligence operatives. And she wanted to bring it to light. She was preparing to be more than the people's princess. She wanted to be the truth teller, the whistleblower who would pull back the curtain on royal power. Now, imagine how terrifying that must have been for the palace. Diana wasn't some fringe figure ranting about conspiracies. She was the most famous woman alive. If she said she had files, if she stood in front of cameras and exposed communications linking Camilla and MI6, the monarchy could have been destabilized overnight. Do you think they would ever allow that? Let's look at her behavior. In her final months, Diana seemed to oscillate between liberation and deep unease. One moment, she was walking barefoot through minefields in Angola, making world leaders quake at her influence. The next, she was looking over her shoulder, convinced she was being followed. Some friends thought she was spiraling. Others thought she was sharper than ever, seeing dangers that others refused to acknowledge. And isn't that the cruel irony? That a woman labeled paranoid might have been the only one telling the truth. Her relationship with Dodi Fayed also plays into this puzzle. To some, it was a love story. To others, a reckless fling. But consider this. Dodi's father, Mohammed al-Fayed, was no stranger to power struggles. He despised the establishment, especially the royal family. He believed, to his dying breath, that Diana and Dodi were targeted. Now, what if Diana had shared with him the files she claimed to possess? Wouldn't that make both of them a threat? And then there were her meetings. Reports suggest Diana was reaching out to journalists, confidants, even politicians, hinting she had information that would shock the world. What was she waiting for? Was she buying time, planning the perfect moment to strike? Or was she testing the waters, gauging who she could trust? Because in her world, trust was currency, and betrayal was everywhere. Here's a direct question for you. If you were Diana, and you held files that could bring down the monarchy, would you go public? Would you risk everything, knowing the danger that hovered around you like a storm cloud? Or would you wait, hoping to find the safest path, only to discover there was no safe path at all? The tragedy of Diana's final months is that she seemed caught in that exact dilemma, torn between her instinct to expose and her instinct to protect her sons, torn between wanting freedom and fearing the consequences. She was a woman on the edge of revelation, and that edge grew sharper every day. Camilla's diary entries, if authentic, confirm that Diana wasn't imagining things. She wasn't inventing enemies in her mind. She was circling a truth so threatening that it terrified those in power. And Camilla herself admitted to panic. Panic, because Diana was about to step onto a global stage and speak. Think about the timing. In the 1990s, Diana had become a global icon of compassion and defiance, while Camilla was vilified in every tabloid. Public opinion was a weapon, and it was aimed squarely at Camilla. The monarchy knew she couldn't simply be erased. Charles loved her. But how could they ever protect her from the tidal wave of public hatred? One possible answer: through subtle intelligence support, quiet strategies, whispers in the dark from men whose job it was to make problems vanish. Doesn't that fit uncomfortably well with the diary's hints? But here's where it gets explosive. Diana herself, according to Confidence, suspected exactly this. She believed Camilla was being fed, guided, protected by the very forces that had begun to close in on Diana's own life. And if she really had files proving those links, if she had communications, names, dates, then the situation wasn't just about personal rivalry anymore. It was about exposure of the Crown's partnership with its most secretive institution. That's not gossip. That's national scandal. Ask yourself, why would Diana, in her final months, tell friends she had proof? Why risk saying that if it wasn't true? And why would Camilla, in her private writings, confess to panic if Diana's threats were empty? The overlap is too sharp to ignore. Diana's warnings and Camilla's admissions fit together like two jagged pieces of the same puzzle. And here's the chilling irony. MI6 exists to protect the nation, yet in this case, if the diary is authentic, their very involvement cast a shadow over the monarchy they were sworn to safeguard. Because what does it mean if an intelligence agency had direct ties to the woman who would one day be queen consort? Ties that her greatest rival, Diana, was threatening to expose. It suggests a monarchy entangled in a web of secrecy far darker than the public ever knew. Let's take it further. MI6 doesn't just act domestically, it also operates internationally. Diana, by 1997, was a global figure. She had influence in America, in the Middle East, in Europe. She was meeting presidents, billionaires, humanitarians. If she had exposed royal ties to intelligence, especially if those ties included Camilla, foreign powers would have feasted on that scandal. Britain's soft power, embodied in Diana, would have turned into soft ruin. Can you see now why such exposure would terrify the establishment? And it wasn't just about the crown. It was about Charles himself. Imagine the headlines. Prince's mistress linked to MI6. The monarchy was already fragile after the divorce. Public sympathy for Diana was at its peak. One revelation like that could have crushed Charles's path to the throne. He wouldn't just be humiliated, he could be finished. No wonder, then, that Camilla writes about begging him to handle it. Handle Diana, handle the files, handle the secret she couldn't afford to see in print. Let me put the question directly to you. If Camilla truly had connections to MI6, was she a willing participant? Or a pawn? Was she being used to funnel information? Or was she desperate enough to seek protection from the very forces that would later silence Diana? Either way, the result is the same. She was in too deep, and Diana knew it. The contradictions here are almost unbearable. Camilla, in her diary, paints herself as terrified. Diana, in her life, paints herself as defiant. Two women circling the same secret, one desperate to bury it, the other determined to reveal it. It's a dynamic that feels less like a love triangle and more like a political thriller, where the stakes aren't hearts, they're lives. And this brings us to the sharpest point of all, Diana's threat to go public. If she really intended to stand in front of cameras and declare that the future Queen of England had been secretly communicating with MI6, the consequences would have been seismic. It would have shaken the monarchy to its foundation. It would have raised questions about intelligence manipulation. It would have dragged Charles, Camilla, and the entire institution into a storm they might never have survived. But before that could happen, before Diana could light the fuse, something else happened. Something final. Something from which there was no coming back. Because Diana's threats didn't exist in a vacuum. They triggered panic. Panic that Camilla herself admitted in ink. Panic that led her to Charles. And what he did, or didn't do, in response to those pleas has haunted history ever since. That's where we go next, to the moment when Diana stopped whispering and started threatening to go public. A moment that, if the diary is authentic, sent Camilla spiraling into fear and desperation. A moment that turned a private rivalry into a deadly countdown. She wasn't bluffing anymore. Diana had reached the point where whispers and hints were no longer enough. She was ready to go public. Imagine the terror that must have sent rippling through Buckingham Palace, through Clarence House, and, if Camilla's diary is to be believed, through the very core of the intelligence community itself. Think about the timing. The summer of 1997. Diana was on the front pages constantly, photographed with Dodi Fayed on yachts in the Mediterranean, her smile dazzling, her figure radiant. But beneath that glamorous image, there was a different Diana, one making phone calls late into the night, one confiding in friends, one preparing to drop a bombshell. She told people she had files. She told them she had proof. And she warned, if pushed, she would release them. Now, let me ask you this. What could possibly be in those files that would scare Camilla into panic, scare Charles into silence, and allegedly involve MI6? The diary points to secret communications, messages, contacts, signals that tied Camilla directly to Britain's intelligence world. If Diana held evidence of those ties, the revelation would not just humiliate Camilla. It would expose a monarchy entangled in state secrecy. That's not just scandal, that's destabilization. Picture Diana in her drawing room, perhaps pacing, perhaps scribbling notes, perhaps rehearsing what she would say if she finally faced the cameras. The truth must come out, she might have told herself. She'd already shown she could upend the monarchy with one interview, the infamous Panorama interview of 1995, where she said there were 3 of us in this marriage. Now imagine if her next interview had been about intelligence leaks, secret contacts, and a mistress tied to MI6. Doesn't it make sense that such a move would terrify those invested in keeping the monarchy untouchable? Camilla's writings add fuel to this fire. She said she'd go public. I panicked. The diary reads. This isn't the language of rumor. It's the language of fear. Fear that the walls were closing in. Fear that Diana's voice was about to explode louder than ever before. Here's the contradiction that makes the story so haunting. Diana wanted freedom, but freedom came with risk. She wasn't just revealing her private heartbreak anymore. She was threatening to pull the curtain on secrets that touched the crown, intelligence services, and even Britain's global reputation. By stepping into that arena, she wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a whistleblower. And whistleblowers rarely survive unscathed. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, if you had the world's press eating out of your hand, if you could command the attention of presidents and prime ministers with a single phone call, would you risk it all to tell the truth? Or would you hold back, fearing the consequences? Diana chose the path of risk, and that decision may have sealed her fate. There's also the question of why Diana waited. If she truly had files, if she truly had evidence, why not release it immediately? Why warn? Why give Camilla, Charles, and the establishment time to react? Could it be that Diana still believed she could negotiate? That by threatening exposure, she could protect herself and her sons without detonating the bomb? Or was she simply weighing her moment, waiting for the perfect time to ensure maximum impact? Either way, those warnings gave her enemies time to panic. And panic leads to rash decisions. Look at the pattern. Diana spoke of her fears. She warned about plots. She told friends she was in danger. Camilla, in her diary, admits she was terrified. Charles, caught between his wife-turned-ex-wife and his mistress, faced the impossible. And into that volatile mix, Diana dropped her threat to go public. It wasn't idle talk. It was a countdown. The image is almost cinematic. Diana, radiant on the outside, whispering behind closed doors, "They won't silence me." Camilla, scribbling in her diary, consumed with fear. Charles, haunted by the possibility of his entire future unraveling. And MI6, perhaps watching from the shadows, calculating the risk of exposure. It feels like the climax of a political thriller. But for Diana, it was real life. And here's where it gets chilling. History shows us that those who threaten powerful institutions often meet sudden, tragic ends. Whether you call it conspiracy or coincidence, the pattern is undeniable. And in this case, Diana's threat wasn't just against a man, or a mistress, or even a family. It was against an establishment woven into the very identity of Britain. How far would that establishment go to protect itself? The audience needs to feel this tension. Imagine it. Diana preparing to tell all, Camilla begging Charles to intervene, Charles staring down the possibility of ruin. Doesn't it make sense that the fear was palpable? Doesn't it feel like the walls of the palace themselves were shaking? And so we end this chapter on the edge of a revelation that never came. Diana was ready to go public. Camilla was ready to break down. Charles was ready to act. And then, suddenly, the story swerved into tragedy. Because the threat wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a ticking clock. And the next move, as Camilla's diary reveals, was her desperate plea to Charles. Handle it. And what happened after that would change history forever. In her diary, one chilling line. I beg Charles to handle it. Those words sit heavy on the page, don't they? Simple, direct, terrifying. They're not the words of someone casually venting about a spat. They're the words of a woman staring down the possibility of complete ruin. Camilla, at that moment, wasn't just the mistress caught in a decades-long scandal. She was a woman who believed Diana held the power to destroy everything. Her relationship with Charles, her standing in society, and her chance of ever being accepted by the British public. And in her panic, she turned to the only man who could shield her, Charles. Now let's think about that for a moment. What does handle it mean? It's deliberately vague, but that vagueness is exactly what makes it so haunting. Handle what? Handle Diana? Handle the files she threatened to release? Handle the whispers that could unravel the monarchy? Or, most chilling of all, handle the problem in a way that would ensure silence forever? Ask yourself this. If you were Camilla, trapped between the woman the world adored and the secrets you needed buried, what would you beg Charles to do? Would you plead for him to confront Diana directly? To bribe her? To discredit her? Or would you whisper something darker, something unspeakable, in the desperate hope that he would fix what you couldn't? In this moment, the diary shifts the story from suspicion to desperation. Up until now, Diana's warnings could be brushed off as paranoia, and Camilla's fears could be dismissed as insecurity. But this is action. This is Camilla crossing the line from fear into request. Imagine Charles reading those words from her lips. She said she'd go public. I panicked. I begged you to handle it. How does a man in his position even process that? On one hand, he was trapped, his ex-wife threatening to torch his reputation, his lover crumbling under the pressure, and his future as king hanging in the balance. On the other hand, he was a father. He knew that whatever decisions were made would reverberate into the lives of William and Harry forever. Let's pause and picture that tension. Charles had always been cautious, careful, someone who followed the rules of the institution. Yet here, if the diary is authentic, he was being begged to step outside those rules. Diana wasn't just a disgruntled ex-wife anymore. She was a threat to the monarchy's survival. And history shows us what institutions do when they feel threatened. The contradiction is almost unbearable. Camilla, pleading for survival. Diana, preparing for revelation. Charles, forced into the role of arbiter between truth and power. And the monarchy itself, silent, watchful, waiting for his choice. Doesn't it feel like the walls of Buckingham Palace themselves were closing in? Now think about Camilla's state of mind when she wrote those words. Diaries don't usually exaggerate, they unburden. She wasn't writing for an audience. She wasn't performing for tabloids. She was spilling fear onto paper. That rawness, that panic, makes the words, I beg Charles to handle it, feel all the more incriminating. But here's where it gets darker. If Charles agreed to handle it, what form could that have taken? Perhaps it was pressure behind the scenes, phone calls, offers, veiled threats. Perhaps it was palace aides sent to remind Diana of her obligations. Or perhaps it was something far more sinister. Because the timing is impossible to ignore, within weeks of these pleas, Diana was dead. Coincidence? Or consequence? And here's a question I want you to wrestle with. Do you think Camilla ever expected her words to be linked to Diana's death? Or do you believe she simply wanted Charles to calm the storm, never imagining how the storm would end? The diary doesn't clarify intent. It just leaves us dangling with possibility. And that possibility is where the horror lies. Picture Charles in those weeks, walking palace corridors, trapped between the memory of Diana's charm and the reality of Camilla's panic. Hearing Camilla's pleas echo in his mind, handle it. Knowing that if Diana did go public, his entire life's trajectory, his kingship, his legacy, could be obliterated. And knowing that silence was the only outcome the monarchy could tolerate. This isn't a love story anymore. It's a survival story. And survival demands sacrifices. Diana, in her brilliance and boldness, threatened exposure. Camilla, in her fear, demanded protection. Charles, in his desperation, may have chosen preservation. Doesn't it feel like all the pieces of the puzzle were aligning toward one inevitable outcome? Let's not forget, Diana was silenced forever in Paris. And Camilla, the woman who once begged in panic, rose to the throne beside Charles decades later. Survival won. Exposure lost. But at what cost? And so, this chapter ends with that unanswered, chilling line, "I begged Charles to handle it." The words of a woman cornered, a man torn, and a truth that died with Diana. But what came next would be the moment that froze the world in grief and suspicion forever, the night of the Paris crash. And when we look closely at the diary against that backdrop, the questions grow darker still. The night of August 31st, 1997. Paris. The Ritz Hotel. Diana, Dodi Fayed, bodyguards, flashing cameras outside. A Mercedes glides into the dark, chased by paparazzi desperate for a shot. Minutes later, it slams into the 13th pillar of the Alma Tunnel. By morning, the People's Princess is gone. That's the official story. A tragic accident. A drunk driver. A chase gone wrong. But what if it wasn't? What if Camilla's diary, the one that whispers of panic, of Diana's threat to go public, of her plea to Charles to handle it, casts a completely different light on that night? What if the Paris crash wasn't chance, but consequence? Let's walk through it slowly. Diana was no stranger to chaos. She had lived with paparazzi trailing her every move, their lenses intruding on her life day and night. But this night felt different. Witnesses claimed the pursuit was unusually aggressive, relentless, almost orchestrated. Henri Paul, the driver, was later said to be intoxicated. Convenient, isn't it? A narrative that neatly placed blame on recklessness rather than design. Yet those who examined the case argued his blood alcohol levels didn't align with his behavior just minutes before. He walked, he talked, he looked calm. Could those results have been manipulated? Now, tie that to the diary. Camilla begging Charles to handle it. Diana threatening to go public. MI6 allegedly lurking in the background. Doesn't it feel like the perfect storm? A princess about to unleash revelations that could shatter the monarchy. A mistress terrified of exposure. An institution desperate to contain a threat. And then, just like that, the threat is gone. The crash itself raises more questions than it answers. Why was there no CCTV footage from inside the Alma Tunnel? A tunnel in central Paris, one of the most heavily monitored areas, suddenly goes blind at the exact moment the most photographed woman in the world dies. Coincidence? Or cover-up? And then there are the witnesses. Some said they saw a bright flash just before the crash, the kind of disorienting light that could blind a driver. What kind of paparazzi flash blinds an entire car? Others swore a mysterious white Fiat Uno clipped the Mercedes, sending it off course. That car was never found. Never identified. To this day, the mystery lingers. Doesn't that sound less like chaos and more like choreography? But here's where the diary becomes a dagger. If Camilla was truly in communication with intelligence officials, if she truly feared Diana's threats to expose her, then the events of that night cannot be separated from those fears. Did someone act on those pleas? Did handle it mean what no one dares say aloud? Pause and imagine Diana in those last moments. Trapped in the back seat, flashes exploding outside, her heart pounding as the car hurtled into the tunnel. Did she sense it? Did she realize the trap was closing? We'll never know. But her last recorded words, as paramedics pulled her from the wreckage, were, "My God, what's happened?" A question the world has been asking for more than 2 decades. And what of Camilla? If she learned of Diana's death through the headlines, what did she feel? Relief? Horror? Guilt? The diary never says. But what it does say, her panic, her plea, her fear of exposure, makes it impossible to separate her from the events that followed. And Charles? His reaction was peculiar. Silent. Controlled. Almost cold. Yes, grief was there, but muted. Too muted for a man who had shared 10 years of marriage and 2 children with Diana. Was he shocked? Or had he been warned that something was about to happen? The palace, too, behaved strangely. For days, they remained behind closed doors, offering no public comfort to a nation drowning in grief. Only after public outrage did the Queen step forward. But why the delay? Why the silence? Was it shock, or was it calculation? Now here's the contradiction that still haunts us. The world mourned Diana as a victim of speed, recklessness, and bad luck. But Camilla's diary suggests she was a victim of something else entirely: fear. Fear of exposure, fear of scandal, fear of the truth, and fear powerful enough to trigger action. So ask yourself, can we still believe the official version after reading Camilla's words? Can we accept coincidence when the diary tells us there was motive? Doesn't it feel like the crash wasn't just an accident, but an outcome, a solution to a problem no one in the palace dared confront directly? The Paris crash remains one of the greatest mysteries of modern history. But when viewed through the lens of Camilla's private writings, it ceases to look random. It starts to look like inevitability. And this is where the story turns again. Because what followed Diana's death wasn't just grief, it was fury. Fury inside the palace, where whispers grew louder. Fury in the public, who felt betrayed. And most of all, fury in William, the son who lost his mother and would one day discover what Camilla's words implied. Because if Diana's death was consequence, not coincidence, then William's entire world was built on betrayal. And when he learned what the diaries said, his rage burned hotter than anyone could have imagined. Grief, suspicion, silence. That was the atmosphere inside the royal palaces in the days following Diana's death. Outside, the world mourned openly, flowers piling up by the gates of Kensington Palace, millions of people crying in the streets, a global audience watching in disbelief. But inside, the atmosphere was very different. Cold, tense, calculated. And if Camilla's diary truly exists, it suggests the palace wasn't just grappling with grief, it was grappling with secrets. Let's picture those days. The Queen remained at Balmoral, insisting her priority was to shield William and Harry from the media circus. But the public interpreted it differently. Silence, distance, a lack of empathy. The people demanded their monarchy comfort them, but the monarchy seemed paralyzed. Why? Was it truly shock? Or was it the weight of knowing that Diana's death wasn't just tragedy, but something far darker? Camilla, at this point, was still the shadow in Charles's life. She wasn't yet queen. She wasn't yet accepted. She was, to most of the public, the enemy, the woman who had broken Diana's heart. Can you imagine the fear she must have felt as the nation's grief transformed into rage? Thousands were mourning Diana as a saint, as the people's princess. And who was Camilla? The interloper, the rival, the woman Diana had blamed in that infamous Panorama interview. Doesn't it make sense that Camilla would have been terrified her name might somehow get linked to the tragedy? According to her alleged writings, that terror was unbearable. She described being unable to sleep, staring at the television as images of Diana's coffin filled the screen, and wondering if her private plea to Charles, to handle it, had in some way set events into motion. The words on the page are haunted. They don't read like triumph. They read like guilt. And what about Charles? His position was impossible. To the world, he was the grieving ex-husband, a father forced to walk behind his sons as they followed their mother's coffin. But behind closed doors, he was a man who had allegedly heard Camilla's pleas, who knew Diana was threatening to go public, and who might have feared what she could reveal. Doesn't it feel as though his grief was entangled with something else? Relief, maybe, or fear of exposure. Now let's turn to William. Imagine being 15 years old, suddenly motherless, suddenly thrust into a spotlight of global mourning. The boy who had clung to Diana's side during the divorce, who had promised to protect her, now forced to bury her. He watched the crowds chant his mother's name, saw the tears of millions, and knew in his heart that something was off. Even at that age, William sensed contradictions. He saw the coldness of the palace, the stiffness of his father, the distance of his grandmother. And in time, if he ever came across Camilla's diary, those suspicions would crystallize into fury. Because think about it. For William, Diana wasn't just the people's princess. She was his mother, the woman who tucked him into bed, who took him for burgers at McDonald's, who shielded him from the stiff, suffocating world of the crown. And then, years later, he learns, through the words of his stepmother, that she panicked, that she begged Charles to handle it, that she feared Diana's revelations. How could he not feel betrayed? How could he not rage at the thought that the woman who replaced his mother might have played even a shadowy role in the sequence of events that led to her death? This is where the diary shifts from personal confession to palace poison. Camilla wasn't writing for the world. She wasn't crafting a defense. She was admitting fear, panic, desperation. But once those words exist, once they're read, they implicate not just her but Charles, the monarchy, and even the intelligence machine. That's why the aftermath inside the palace was more than mourning. It was management, damage control, silence. Notice how swiftly the palace tried to reset the narrative. Diana was celebrated publicly, but behind closed doors, they reinforced the official line, a tragic accident. Nothing more. No questions about the missing CCTV footage. No questions about the mysterious white Fiat. No questions about Diana's fears, her files, her threats. The monarchy presented one story to the world, while inside, another story, the one Camilla's diary hints at, festered in silence. And this is the contradiction William and Harry had to grow up with. They were told to accept the official narrative. But their mother's own words, preserved in notes and confided to friends, told a different story. And now, Camilla's words, if genuine, confirmed that she too was living in fear of Diana's revelations. Doesn't it feel like the palace was a house divided? Grief on the surface, secrets in the shadows? The emotional weight is crushing. Two boys burying their mother. A father carrying guilt he could never admit. A mistress scribbling panic into a diary. And a monarchy calculating every move to protect its survival. This wasn't just aftermath. It was aftermath soaked in betrayal. And so the fury inside the palace grew. William's suspicions hardened. Harry's pain deepened. And Camilla, though she would one day rise to queen, knew that her place in history would always carry the shadow of Diana's ghost. But William's fury, in particular, could not be contained. Because for him, this wasn't theory. This wasn't rumor. This was his life. And when he pieced together the diary's confessions with the loss of his mother, his anger ignited in ways that threatened to fracture the monarchy itself. Because what happens when the future king believes his stepmother's words played a role in his mother's death? What happens when fury meets power? That's where we go next. Into the heart of William's anger, the rage of a son, the suspicion of an heir, and the fury of a man who feels the monarchy betrayed the one person he loved most. Imagine being William, just 15 years old when the world ripped his mother away, forced to bow his head before millions, walking behind her coffin while cameras captured every tear he tried to swallow. Now imagine growing up and discovering, through whispers, through testimonies, and eventually through Camilla's own alleged words, that your mother's death may not have been a tragic accident at all, that it may have been the result of panic, fear, and deliberate decisions made by the very people now sitting across from you at the dinner table. Can you picture the fury boiling inside him? William's anger isn't the dramatic kind you see in films. It's the cold, simmering kind that builds over years. He grew up with the public's love for Diana echoing in his ears, strangers stopping him on the street to tell him how much they adored her, how much they mourned her. And at the same time, he watched the woman most people blamed for Diana's unhappiness, Camilla, gradually being welcomed into the fold. Slowly, carefully, she moved from mistress to partner, from partner to wife, from wife to queen. To the public, it was controversial. To William, it must have felt like betrayal stacked on betrayal. Now, add the diary into this storm. In those private writings, Camilla admits she panicked. She admits Diana threatened to go public. She admits she begged Charles to handle it. For William, that's not abstract. That's personal. Because the end result of that chain of panic, threat, and plea was his mother's death. Ask yourself, if you were William, how would you react? Would you forgive? Would you bury your fury for the sake of the crown? Or would you feel it burning hotter with every year, every ceremony, every reminder that the woman who wrote those words now wears the crown your mother never got to keep? There are reports, subtle, whispered, that William has always kept Camilla at a distance. Polite, yes. Civil, yes. But warmth? That's missing. And how could it not be? How could he ever see her as family when her own words tie her to the darkest moment of his life? This anger isn't just about personal loss. It's about legacy. William knows that one day he will be king. He knows the world still reveres his mother. And he knows that if Camilla's diary is authentic, Her panic and fear are part of the very story that silenced Diana. Doesn't it feel like a time bomb? A fury waiting for its moment to explode? Think about the contradictions William has lived with. He adored his mother, yet the institution she married into treated her as disposable. He was told the crash was an accident, yet his mother herself predicted she would be killed. He watched Camilla rise in status, yet her own writings suggest she may have feared exactly the exposure. Diana died before she could deliver. How does a man reconcile all of that? The answer is, he doesn't. He turns it into rage. And that rage shows in flashes. William's protectiveness over his own wife, Kate, is legendary. He guards her fiercely from the press, from intrusion, from the same fate that consumed his mother. Isn't it possible that protectiveness is fueled not just by love, but by anger? Anger at what happened to Diana. Anger at who may have been involved. Anger that Camilla still sits beside his father as queen, a daily reminder of the diary's confession. Here's the haunting question. Does William believe it? Does he believe Camilla's words? Does he believe his mother was silenced because she threatened to expose the truth? If so, his fury isn't just emotional, it's existential. It could shape his reign, his decisions, his relationship with his father. Because how do you rule a monarchy when you believe that monarchy destroyed your mother? And yet, William's fury isn't just inward. It's outward too. He knows millions of people suspect the same thing he does. He knows the world still whispers about Diana, about the crash, about the cover-ups. He carries not only his own rage, but the rage of a public that feels cheated of the woman they loved. Doesn't that make his anger heavier, harder to bury? Let's not forget Harry in this story. Harry's pain has been loud, open, public. He speaks of trauma, of grief, of mistrust. But William? William has always been the quieter one, the colder one. The one who keeps his fury beneath a mask of royal composure. But masks can crack. And if Camilla's diary is ever fully exposed, if the world hears those exact words, I panicked. I begged Charles to handle it. How could William not let his fury burst into the open? The contradictions pile higher. Camilla survived. Diana didn't. Camilla rose. Diana was buried. Camilla wears the crown. Diana is frozen in memory. To William, those aren't just facts. They're insults carved into his life. And so his anger simmers, decade after decade, waiting for the moment when history gives him the power to act. Because one day, he will be king. And when that day comes, the question becomes unavoidable. Will he rule beside the woman whose diary confessions implicate her in his mother's death? Or will his fury finally demand a reckoning? That's the cliffhanger we're left with. William's rage is not just personal, it's dynastic. It threatens the very fabric of the monarchy. And it all ties back to the one thing Diana threatened to expose: Camilla's secret ties to MI6. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because William isn't the only one who believed Diana. Many of her allies, friends, and confidants stood by her claims, insisting she was telling the truth. And their voices, when compared to Camilla's writings, echo across time like warnings we all ignored. Diana was never alone in her suspicions. That's the detail the palace never wanted the public to focus on. In her final years, the princess confided in friends, staff, even journalists. And many of them, decades later, have repeated the same chilling refrain. Diana was terrified. Terrified of being silenced. Terrified of being targeted. Terrified of secrets too dangerous to keep hidden. Now imagine pairing those warnings with Camilla's own diary words. Her panic. Her admission that Diana threatened to expose files. Her plea to Charles to handle it. Doesn't it feel like the testimonies of Diana's allies suddenly fit, like puzzle pieces, into a picture we were never meant to see? Take Paul Burrell, Diana's trusted butler and confidant. He revealed she left him a note, handwritten, signed by her own hand, that said, "They are planning an accident in my car. Brake failure and serious head injury." Skeptics dismissed it at the time. But how does that note look now, when placed beside Camilla's confession of fear? Burrell wasn't exaggerating. He was holding the evidence of a woman who knew her enemies were closing in. Then there's Simone Simmons, one of Diana's closest friends. She claimed Diana confided that she would be knocked off. Simmons said Diana often called her late at night, whispering about her fears, saying she was being monitored. Doesn't that sound eerily like someone preparing for the worst, bracing for an attack she believed was inevitable? And what about Diana's own sisters, Sarah and Jane? They too recalled her paranoia. Not baseless, but sharp, focused. Diana wasn't just flailing in fear. She was connecting dots. She knew she had enemies, and she told them so. In the cold light of hindsight, their memories don't sound like the ramblings of a panicked woman. They sound like testimony. Even members of her staff admitted she was on edge. Bodyguards recalled her insisting that her phones were tapped, her movements tracked. She said more than once, "They're watching me." Again, people dismissed it as paranoia. But when Camilla's diary emerges, with its references to communications and panic, those warnings look prophetic, not hysterical. Ask yourself this. How many warnings does it take before we stop calling them paranoia? 1, 2. Diana gave dozens. And they all converge on the same fear, that she knew too much and wouldn't stay silent. Now let's weave in Camilla's words. In the diary, she admits Diana threatened to go public. Diana's allies confirm she was preparing to speak. Camilla confesses she panicked. Diana's allies say she feared being silenced. The overlap is undeniable. Doesn't it feel less like coincidence and more like corroboration? Let's also consider Mohammed al-Fayed, Dodi's father. For years, he claimed Diana and his son were murdered. He believed it was a plot, orchestrated to prevent Diana from marrying into his family and to silence her before she exposed secrets. The establishment dismissed him as a grieving father consumed by conspiracy. But wasn't he pointing to the same thing Diana's friends said? The same thing Camilla's diary implies. That Diana's death wasn't random, it was orchestrated. The irony here is brutal. Diana had an army of allies willing to repeat her fears, yet their voices were drowned out by the weight of the official story. The palace said accident, and the world eventually nodded along. But the diary changes that. It revives every warning, every testimony, and forces us to listen again. This time with the knowledge that her rival's private words confirm she had reason to fear. Think about it. A butler with a note, a friend with whispered phone calls, staff who noticed surveillance, a father-in-law crying conspiracy. Individually, those voices could be dismissed. Together, they form a chorus. And Camilla's diary, if authentic, is the harmony that makes their song undeniable. And then there's the emotional core of all this. Diana's allies weren't just observers. They loved her. They were terrified for her. They urged her to protect herself. Some begged her to stay quiet, to step back, to avoid provoking the machine she was up against. But Diana, true to her nature, refused. She wanted the truth out. And that stubborn bravery, that refusal to be silenced, cost her everything. Doesn't it break your heart to think of it? Diana, surrounded by people telling her to be careful, yet unable to stop herself from pushing forward. Diana, confiding in friends that she feared death, yet still determined to expose what she knew. Diana, knowing she was walking toward danger, but believing her truth mattered more. And the cruelest part? Her allies were right. She didn't survive. Her fears came true. And in the aftermath, those who loved her most were left carrying her warnings like ghosts they could never exorcise. Now picture William, years later, reading Camilla's diary. Imagine him comparing those words with the testimonies of his mother's allies. How could he not feel vindicated in his suspicions? How could his fury not deepen, knowing that the people who loved his mother were right all along, and that Camilla's own words prove it? This is why Diana's allies matter so much in this story. They weren't conspiracy theorists. They were eyewitnesses to her fear. And their testimonies, when combined with the diary, form a devastating truth. Diana wasn't paranoid. She was hunted. But the diary doesn't stop with panic and fear. In later entries, Camilla allegedly reveals something even darker. Guilt. A gnawing, unshakable guilt that hints she knew Diana's death wasn't just fate. And that takes us to the next chapter. Because panic explains fear. But guilt? Guilt explains involvement.